I learned something important at 68 years old. The person who grabs the remote control in your house sometimes thinks he controls everything else too. That evening started like hundreds of others before it. I was sitting in my favorite recliner in the living room, the soft brown one near the window, with a knitted blanket across my knees and a mug of chamomile tea resting on the side table. My program had just started, the same mystery series I had watched every Tuesday night for nearly 5 years. The theme music was playing softly through the television speakers, and for a moment the house felt calm, the kind of calm that comes at the end of a long day when everyone has finally settled down. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and until that night I believed I understood my place in my daughter's home. I had moved in 3 years earlier after my husband passed away. Linda insisted I shouldn't be alone, and I believed her when she said we would take care of each other. At first it truly felt that way. I helped cook dinners, watched my grandson after school, folded laundry, and tried to stay out of the way whenever Linda and her husband Jason wanted quiet time. I never asked for much. Just my chair, my evening tea, and my television show. That night the clock on the wall read 8:07 p.m. when I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. Jason Carter stepped into the living room still wearing his work boots. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask what I was watching. He simply looked at the screen with a small frown like someone inspecting something unpleasant. Before I could say a word he reached down to the coffee table, picked up the remote control, and with one quick motion the television went dark. The room fell silent so suddenly that I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock down the hall. Jason shook his head once and said in a flat voice, "Enough of this trash." For a second I thought maybe he was joking. But he wasn't smiling. He tossed the remote back onto the table and walked toward the kitchen like nothing unusual had happened. I sat there staring at the blank screen, my reflection faintly staring back at me. In 68 years of life, raising children, working part-time jobs, and sharing a home with a man who always believed in simple respect, no one had ever spoken to me quite like that inside my own living room. I didn't shout after him. I didn't argue. I didn't even pick the remote up again. Instead, I folded my hands on the blanket and listened to the quiet house around me. From the kitchen I could hear Jason opening the refrigerator. Somewhere upstairs my grandson was laughing at something on his tablet. Life in the house continued as if nothing had happened, but something had changed in that moment, something Jason clearly didn't realize. Because while he believed he had just turned off an old woman's television show, he had actually switched on a thought that would follow me straight into the next morning. That night I did not turn the television back on. I simply sat there for another minute, staring at the dark screen while the quiet hum of the refrigerator drifted in from the kitchen. It was strange how a single sentence could change the way a room felt. Just a few minutes earlier, the living room had felt warm and familiar. Now it felt like I was sitting in someone else's house. I slowly pushed the blanket off my knees and stood up from the recliner. My joints were a little stiff the way they always were in the evening, but I moved carefully across the carpet and set my empty teacup in the sink. Jason was leaning against the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. He did not look up when I entered the room. For a brief moment I considered saying something polite like asking how his day had been, the kind of small conversation that keeps peace inside a shared home. But the words would not come. Instead, I simply rinsed my cup and placed it on the drying rack. The silence between us felt thick and uncomfortable. Finally Jason glanced up and shrugged slightly. "You really watch those shows every night?" he asked. His voice carried the same dismissive tone he had used earlier. I answered calmly. "Only once a week. Tuesday nights." He gave a small laugh that did not sound friendly. "Still seems like a waste of time." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed but because I had learned something over many years of raising a family. Not every moment deserves an argument. Sometimes it is better to observe. Sometimes it is better to listen carefully and remember. I left the kitchen and walked down the hallway toward my room. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of my grandson talking to someone through his headphones upstairs. When I closed my bedroom door, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that had become mine during the last 3 years. The dresser held a few framed photos from my life. One picture showed Linda when she was 8 years old standing in front of her elementary school wearing a bright red backpack. Another showed my late husband Thomas holding our granddaughter when she was just a baby. Those photographs reminded me why I had agreed to move into this house in the first place. After Thomas passed away, Linda insisted I should not live alone in the small condo where we had spent 25 years together. She said the extra bedroom here would be perfect. She said we would all support each other. And for a long time that promise felt true. I helped with groceries. I drove my grandson to soccer practice every Saturday morning. When Linda worked late shifts at the hospital, I made sure dinner was ready when she came home. None of those things felt like a burden to me. That is simply what families do. But as I sat there in the quiet bedroom that night, Jason's words echoed in my mind again. Enough of this trash. It was not really about a television show. Anyone who has lived long enough learns to hear the meaning behind certain words. The way he had said it made something very clear. In Jason's mind, this house belonged to him. The living room belonged to him. Even the remote control in his hand seemed to carry a kind of authority he believed I did not have. What he did not know was that houses have histories, and this one had a story he had never bothered to ask about. I reached for the small notebook on my bedside table where I kept reminders and important phone numbers. My reading glasses rested beside it. I slipped them on and opened the notebook to a page I had not looked at in quite some time. There was a name written there in careful blue ink along with a phone number from the same year Linda and Jason first bought this house. I studied that name quietly for a moment. Then I closed the notebook again and turned off the bedside lamp. Because the truth was simple. Jason believed he had ended my evening when he pressed that button on the remote control. But what he had really done was start something that would continue the very next morning. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, just after 6 o'clock, when the first pale light began slipping through the thin curtains beside my bed. The house was quiet in that peaceful way it always was before everyone else woke up. For a moment I lay there listening to the distant sound of a garbage truck moving slowly down the street and the faint chirping of birds outside the window. Normally mornings were my favorite time of day. But that morning my mind returned immediately to the moment from the night before, the black television screen, Jason standing there with the remote in his hand, and the careless sentence he had thrown into the room as if it meant nothing. Enough of this trash. I sat up slowly and reached for my reading glasses on the nightstand. The small notebook was still there exactly where I had left it. I opened it again and looked at the name written across the page. Robert Klein. Beneath it was a phone number I had known for more than 15 years. Robert had helped Thomas and me handle several important documents back when we still lived in our old condo. After my husband passed away, Robert was also the one who helped organize the paperwork that allowed Linda and Jason to buy this house when their finances were still uncertain. That memory returned clearly now. I could still picture the day we sat around the large wooden desk in Robert's office. Linda had looked nervous but hopeful. Jason had seemed impatient, tapping his fingers on the arm of the chair. The bank had hesitated because Jason's credit history was still too short and Linda's student loans were high. That was when I quietly offered to help. Not because anyone demanded it. Not because I wanted control. I did it because that is what mothers do when their children are trying to build a life. I remember Robert explaining each document carefully while sunlight poured through the tall office windows. Some papers carried my name alongside theirs. Some agreements involved my savings that Thomas and I had built over decades of careful work. At the time, none of it felt complicated or risky. It simply felt like helping family. Now, sitting on the edge of my bed 3 years later, I realized something important. Jason might have believed he understood exactly who held authority in this house. But he had never actually asked about the details behind those documents. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back on the nightstand before walking toward the kitchen. The hardwood floor felt cool beneath my feet as I moved down the hallway. When I entered the kitchen, the digital clock on the microwave read 6:32. I filled the coffee maker with water, measured out the grounds, and pressed the start button. The quiet bubbling sound filled the room as the machine began brewing. A few minutes later, the rich smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. I poured a cup and sat down at the small breakfast table near the window. Outside, a light morning breeze moved the branches of the maple tree in the front yard. Everything looked peaceful and ordinary. Yet inside my mind a decision was forming with calm clarity. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the need to raise my voice or start a confrontation that would echo through the house. After raising a child and sharing nearly 40 years of marriage, I understood that the strongest responses are often the quiet ones. I finished my coffee slowly and then reached for my phone. For a moment I studied the number written in the notebook. It had been a long time since I had spoken with Robert Klein, but some relationships built over many years do not disappear simply because time passes. I pressed the number carefully and lifted the phone to my ear while the call connected. The line rang once. Then twice. And when Robert's familiar voice finally answered on the other end, I realized that the simple act of dialing that number had already begun to change the direction of everything that would happen next. I held the phone against my ear while the soft morning light continued to fill the kitchen. After the third ring I heard the calm, steady voice I remembered so well. Robert Klein speaking. His tone sounded exactly the same as it had years ago, professional but warm, the kind of voice that made complicated matters feel manageable. "Good morning, Robert," I said gently. "This is Margaret Whitmore." There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when someone searches their memory, and then his voice brightened with recognition. "Margaret Whitmore. Of course. It has been a long time. How have you been?" I glanced out the kitchen window at the quiet street before answering. "I have been well enough. I hope I am not calling too early." Robert gave a small chuckle. "Not at all. I am already at the office. What can I help you with today?" I folded my hands around my coffee cup, feeling the warmth against my fingers while I chose my words carefully. I wanted to ask about some documents we handled a few years ago. The house purchase for my daughter Linda and her husband Jason. Robert did not respond immediately, but I could hear the faint sound of papers moving on his desk as if he was already thinking through old files in his mind. "Yes, I remember that situation," he said slowly. "You were involved in the financing arrangements." His choice of words was polite and precise, exactly what I expected from a lawyer who had spent decades explaining complicated details to families. "That is correct," I replied. "I just wanted to confirm something. My understanding is that my name was included in certain agreements connected to that property." Robert spoke calmly, the way someone does when discussing facts rather than opinions. "Yes, Margaret. Your name is connected to the mortgage guarantee and also to a shared ownership clause. We structured it that way because the bank required additional financial backing at the time." I took a quiet breath. The information did not surprise me, but hearing it spoken aloud carried a certain clarity. "So technically speaking," I continued carefully, "I still hold a legal interest in that property." Robert answered without hesitation. "Yes, you do. It is not uncommon in family situations where parents assist with large purchases. Your contribution gave you legal standing. Why do you ask?" I let a moment pass before responding. The kitchen clock ticked softly on the wall while I watched the sunlight spread across the wooden table. "I suppose I simply wanted to understand my position clearly," I said. "Sometimes it is good to review important matters after some time has passed." Robert's tone remained thoughtful but slightly curious. "Of course. If you ever want to review the paperwork in detail, we can schedule a meeting." I keep copies of everything in the file. I thanked him politely and we spoke for another minute about ordinary things, the weather, how long it had been since our last conversation, the way life has a habit of moving quickly without asking permission. When the call ended, I placed the phone gently on the table and sat there quietly for a moment. Outside, the neighborhood had begun to wake up. A neighbor across the street was backing his car out of the driveway, and somewhere down the block a dog barked twice before falling silent again. Everything appeared peaceful and routine. Yet something inside me had settled into a calm certainty. The facts were simple. I had never tried to control this house. I had never demanded recognition or authority. But the documents Robert described were real, and they existed whether Jason knew about them or not. I stood up from the table, rinsed my empty coffee cup, and placed it in the sink. Upstairs I could hear footsteps as my grandson started getting ready for school. Soon the house would be busy again with morning routines, backpacks, car keys, and hurried conversations. I walked back toward the hallway feeling steady and clear in my thoughts. Jason believed he had ended a small moment of my evening by pressing a button on a remote control. What he did not realize was that the quiet phone call I had just finished would soon remind him that houses are not defined by who holds the remote, but by the agreements that built the roof over everyone's head. After finishing my morning call with Robert Klein, I moved through the rest of the day the same way I always did, quietly and without drawing attention to anything unusual. Linda rushed out the door around 7:30 with her travel mug of coffee and her hospital badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck. She gave me a quick hug before leaving, the same quick hug she had given me nearly every morning since I moved into the house. My grandson followed a few minutes later, half awake and carrying a backpack that always seemed too large for his shoulders. I reminded him to bring his lunch from the refrigerator and he thanked me before heading outside to catch the school bus. By 8 o'clock the house had grown calm again. The only person left besides me was Jason, who worked from home 2 days a week. I could hear him in the small office down the hallway typing steadily on his computer keyboard. Normally I would spend the morning doing small household things like folding laundry or watering the plants near the windows, but that morning I found myself thinking carefully about everything Robert had explained on the phone. The documents connected to this house were not vague memories or old assumptions. They were real agreements signed at a polished wooden desk on a sunny afternoon years ago. I remembered the details clearly now. The bank had required additional financial support before approving the mortgage. That support had come from the savings Thomas and I built over decades of careful planning. My name had not been added out of sentiment or politeness. It had been added because without it the purchase would never have been approved. Around 10 o'clock I stepped outside onto the back patio with a cup of tea and sat down in the same chair where I often read in the afternoons. The air carried the early autumn coolness that made the sunlight feel gentle rather than hot. I watched a pair of squirrels move quickly along the fence line while thinking about something else Robert had said during our conversation. If I ever wanted to review the paperwork in detail, his office still kept copies of everything. That meant the agreements were not just memories stored in my mind. They existed in files, in records, in documents that carried signatures and dates. The thought did not make me feel powerful or triumphant. Instead, it gave me a sense of calm clarity. Respect inside a family should never depend on legal documents. But sometimes those documents remind people of realities they have forgotten. Around noon I returned inside and prepared a simple lunch for myself. Jason walked through the kitchen while I was placing a bowl of soup on the table. He barely looked in my direction as he opened the refrigerator and took out a bottle of sparkling water. For a moment he studied the contents of the fridge and then said casually, "We should probably clear some space in here. It is getting crowded." His tone sounded ordinary, but there was something beneath it that suggested the same quiet dismissal I had heard the night before. I answered politely, "I will take a look at it later this afternoon." He nodded without much interest and returned to his office. I finished my lunch slowly, rinsed my bowl in the sink, and wiped the kitchen counter the way I always did. Nothing about the scene would have looked unusual to anyone passing by the window. Yet the simple truth remained that Jason still believed the house operated under his control alone. He believed small decisions about televisions, refrigerators, and living room space were his to make without question. What he did not realize was that the quiet phone call I made that morning was only the first step in understanding exactly where everyone truly stood. And as the afternoon sunlight began stretching across the kitchen floor, I realized that before long Jason would learn that some houses carry stories hidden beneath the surface. Stories written not just in memories but in signatures placed carefully on paper years before anyone thought to ask who really held the keys. That afternoon passed quietly, almost too quietly, as if the house itself was holding its breath. After lunch I cleaned the kitchen, wiped down the counters, and placed the dish towel neatly back on its hook beside the sink. Jason remained in his office for most of the afternoon, occasionally walking through the hallway to refill his water bottle or grab a snack from the pantry. Each time he passed by me he behaved as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. His voice remained neutral, polite in a distant way, the kind of politeness people use when they are certain their position does not need explaining. I responded the same way I always had, calm and respectful. Years of life had taught me that patience often reveals far more than confrontation ever could. Around 3:30 the school bus stopped at the corner of our street, and a few minutes later my grandson pushed the front door open with his usual burst of afternoon energy. His backpack dropped onto the floor with a soft thud and he called out a cheerful greeting when he saw me in the living room. I asked him about his day, and he told me about a science quiz and a soccer practice scheduled for the weekend. I prepared a small snack for him and watched as he hurried upstairs to start his homework. Moments like that reminded me why I had agreed to move into this house in the first place. Family life is often made of simple routines that seem small but carry quiet meaning. As the afternoon turned into early evening I began preparing dinner, chopping vegetables and heating a pan on the stove while the warm smell of garlic filled the kitchen. Linda arrived home shortly after 6 o'clock looking tired from her shift at the hospital but grateful to see a hot meal waiting. She thanked me the same way she always did, placing her purse on the counter and loosening the strap of her work badge. Jason joined us a few minutes later, and the four of us sat around the dining table together. Conversation moved through ordinary topics, school assignments, work schedules, the weather forecast for the weekend. Anyone watching from outside the window would have seen what looked like a perfectly normal family dinner. Yet beneath the surface something remained unspoken. Jason spoke confidently about small things around the house, mentioning a few plans he had for reorganizing the garage and possibly replacing the television in the living room with a larger screen. He spoke as though these decisions belonged entirely to him. I listened quietly while finishing my meal. The calm certainty I felt earlier that morning had not faded. In fact, it had grown clearer with every passing hour. After dinner I helped clear the table and rinsed the dishes while Linda packed leftovers into containers for the refrigerator. Jason returned to the living room and turned on the television, flipping through several channels before settling on a sports broadcast. I dried my hands with the kitchen towel and walked into the living room just long enough to collect the small book I had left on the side table. Jason did not look up as I passed behind the couch. I paused for a moment beside the television stand, noticing the remote control resting exactly where he had tossed it the night before. For a brief second I considered picking it up and turning the television off the same way he had done to me. But that would have been a childish response, and childish responses rarely solve anything. Instead I simply picked up my book and returned to my room. The evening continued quietly after that. Yet while the house moved through its usual routine of television noise, homework, and the soft closing of bedroom doors, I knew something Jason did not. Earlier that afternoon I had called Robert Klein one more time after our morning conversation. During that second call we scheduled a meeting at his office for the following morning at 10:30. It would be a simple meeting, just a review of documents and a calm discussion about certain legal details connected to this house. Jason still believed the events of the previous night had ended with the press of a button on a remote control. What he did not understand was that the next day would introduce a conversation built on signatures, agreements, and facts that could not be dismissed as easily as a television program. The next morning arrived with a quiet clarity that felt almost unusual. I woke up before the alarm on my bedside clock, the pale blue light of early morning stretching softly across the ceiling. For a moment I simply lay there listening to the gentle sounds of the house settling into another day. Somewhere down the hall a floorboard creaked as the air conditioning system turned on, and outside a passing car rolled slowly along the street. My meeting with Robert Klein was scheduled for 10:30 that morning, which meant there was plenty of time before I needed to leave the house. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy cardigan and a pair of comfortable shoes, the kind I always wore when running errands or attending appointments. There was nothing dramatic about the morning. In fact, I made sure everything appeared completely ordinary. When I stepped into the kitchen around 7 o'clock, Linda was already pouring herself a cup of coffee before leaving for work. She looked tired but smiled when she saw me. "Morning, Mom," she said, reaching for a travel lid for her mug. "Morning, sweetheart," I replied warmly. I asked about her shift at the hospital, and she told me it had been busy, but manageable. Jason entered the kitchen a few minutes later, still scrolling through his phone while grabbing a protein bar from the counter. He nodded briefly in my direction but did not stop walking. The quiet confidence in his movements suggested he still believed everything in the house operated exactly the way he expected it to. None of them knew about my meeting that morning, and I did not feel the need to announce it. Some conversations are better handled privately before being shared. After Linda left for work and my grandson headed off to school, the house returned to its usual weekday quiet. Jason remained in his office again, typing steadily on his computer while occasionally pacing the hallway during phone calls related to his job. I spent the morning doing small things around the house, folding laundry, watering the plants near the living room window, and straightening the cushions on the couch. At 9:45 I picked up my purse from the hallway table and slipped my phone inside. As I passed the office doorway, Jason glanced up briefly. "Heading out?" he asked. "Just running a quick errand," I replied calmly. He nodded and returned to his computer screen without another question. The drive to Robert Klein's office took about 20 minutes through familiar streets lined with tall maple trees that were just beginning to change color for autumn. When I parked in front of the small brick building, I felt the same steady calm that had settled over me since yesterday morning. Robert's office had not changed much over the years. The same polished wood desk stood near the window, and shelves filled with neatly arranged files lined the walls behind him. When I entered, he stood up to greet me with a friendly handshake and a warm smile. "Margaret, it is good to see you again," he said sincerely. I thanked him and sat down in the chair across from his desk. For the next 30 minutes we reviewed several documents together. Robert opened a thick folder and carefully explained each agreement in clear, simple language. There were signatures, dates, and clauses that described exactly how my financial contribution had been structured when Linda and Jason purchased the house. One particular document confirmed something very important. My name was not simply attached as a temporary reference. It existed within a legal ownership structure that gave me measurable standing connected to the property itself. Robert spoke calmly as he pointed to certain sections of the paperwork. "These provisions mean you have options," he explained gently. "You can maintain the current arrangement, or if circumstances ever change, there are formal ways to address your share." I nodded quietly while studying the document. Hearing those words did not bring anger or satisfaction. Instead, it brought clarity. Families should treat one another with respect long before legal details ever become necessary. But sometimes those details serve as reminders of reality when someone begins to forget. By the time I left Robert's office, the morning sun had climbed higher into the sky and the sidewalks outside were busy with people moving through their daily routines. As I drove home, I realized something Jason still did not understand. Yesterday evening, he believed he had ended a small moment in the living room by switching off a television. What he had actually done was begin a chain of events that would soon remind him that the foundations of a house are not defined by who holds the remote control, but by the agreements written long before anyone decides to call something trash. When I returned home that afternoon, the house looked exactly the same as it always did, the quiet suburban street, the maple tree casting its familiar shadow across the driveway, and the white porch railing that Linda had painted 2 summers earlier. Yet as I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, I carried a calm certainty with me that had not existed a few days earlier. Inside my purse rested a thin envelope Robert Klein had prepared after our meeting, containing printed copies of the most relevant documents we had discussed that morning. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, simply clear records that explained the legal structure behind the house we were all living in. I walked up the front steps and opened the door just as I had done hundreds of times before. The sound of Jason's voice drifted from the office down the hallway as he spoke during a work call, his tone confident and casual. I hung my purse on the small hook near the door and moved into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. The clock on the microwave read 12:47. In a few hours Linda would return from work and my grandson would come home from school, bringing the usual afternoon energy back into the house. For now everything remained quiet. I sat down at the kitchen table and placed the envelope in front of me, resting my hand lightly on top of it while thinking about the conversation I had just had with Robert. He had explained my options in calm, careful language. There were several possible paths forward, none of them aggressive or confrontational. I could leave everything exactly as it was and simply maintain the current arrangement. I could formally review the ownership structure with Linda and Jason so everyone understood the situation clearly. Or, if circumstances ever became uncomfortable enough, I could request that my share of the property be formally addressed, something that would require a legal discussion about buying out my portion or restructuring the agreement entirely. Robert had emphasized that these were simply options, tools provided by the agreements we had signed years ago. The purpose of those agreements was never to create conflict. Their purpose was to ensure fairness and clarity if life ever became complicated. As I sat there thinking about those possibilities, Jason's office door opened and he walked into the kitchen while finishing his phone call. He nodded in my direction and opened the refrigerator again, scanning the shelves as if he expected something new to appear each time he looked. When he ended his call, he leaned casually against the counter and took a sip from a bottle of sparkling water. "Quiet day?" he asked. "Pretty quiet," I answered calmly. He nodded again and glanced toward the living room where the television sat on its stand exactly where it had always been. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. I could tell he assumed the small moment from 2 nights earlier had already been forgotten, just another minor interaction inside a busy household. But the envelope resting beneath my hand reminded me that some moments carry more meaning than people realize. Later that evening, after Linda returned home and dinner had finished, I planned to have a calm conversation with both of them at the table. Not an argument, not a confrontation, simply a conversation built on facts. Because respect inside a family should never require legal paperwork to exist, yet sometimes people only understand the value of respect when they are reminded of the agreements quietly holding everything together. Jason still believed the story of this house was simple, that he stood at the center of every decision within these walls. What he did not yet understand was that the documents inside the envelope resting on my kitchen table told a much longer story, one that would soon become impossible for him to ignore. That evening unfolded with the same familiar rhythm the house had followed for years. Around 5:30 the sound of the school bus echoed faintly down the street, and a few minutes later my grandson stepped through the front door with the same energetic greeting he always offered after school. Linda arrived shortly after 6, her shoulders slightly tired from a long shift at the hospital but her expression softening when she smelled dinner warming on the stove. Jason came out of his office and joined us at the dining table just as he had the night before. From the outside it would have looked like an ordinary family meal. Plates were passed, glasses were filled with water, and the conversation moved through simple topics about school, work schedules, and weekend plans. Yet as we finished eating and the dishes were cleared away, I realized the moment for the conversation I had been preparing had finally arrived. I placed the thin envelope on the center of the dining table and sat down calmly across from Linda and Jason. They both looked at it with mild curiosity. Linda tilted her head slightly. "Mom, what is that?" she asked gently. I folded my hands together on the table before answering. "It is something I wanted to share with both of you so there will be no confusion about this house." Jason leaned back slightly in his chair while Linda reached for the envelope. Inside were the copies Robert Klein had printed for me that morning. Linda read quietly for a moment, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise as she recognized the documents. Jason leaned forward to look more closely, his confident posture gradually becoming still. I spoke calmly while they read. I explained how the agreements had been arranged years earlier when the bank required additional financial backing before approving the mortgage. I reminded them that the contribution Thomas and I made had not simply been a temporary favor. It had been structured as a legal share connected to the property itself. The room remained silent except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Jason finally placed the papers back on the table and looked at me with a seriousness I had not seen from him before. I did not raise my voice or accuse anyone of anything. I simply explained that the purpose of bringing this information forward was clarity. Families function best when respect exists naturally, without reminders. But respect cannot survive if someone believes they alone control a space that was built with help from others. I told them I had no interest in arguments or legal battles. My intention was simply to ensure everyone understood the truth behind the house we shared. Linda nodded slowly, clearly remembering the difficult process of buying the house years earlier. Jason remained quiet for a moment longer before finally speaking in a tone far more careful than before. In that quiet dining room it became clear that something important had shifted. The story of this house was no longer based on assumptions about who held the remote control or who made the loudest decisions. Instead, it rested on a simple reality written in signatures and agreements long before that evening arrived. And as the conversation ended and I stood up to return the documents to my purse, I understood that sometimes the calmest response carries the strongest lesson of all.